Is the world losing its fight against malaria? A new report suggests the resurgence of the mosquito-borne disease could cause more deaths, particularly in parts of Africa. But what's behind this, and what should be done to avoid a catastrophe? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Each year there are an estimated 263 million malaria cases around the world, with nearly 600,000 deaths in 83 countries, a majority of them in Africa. For decades, scientists and governments have poured billions of dollars into trying to eradicate the disease. But a new report from the African Leaders Malaria Alliance is warning that after years of progress, funding cuts are threatening to unleash the worst resurgence ever. The report says without significant investment, outbreaks will get worse and cause nearly 1 million additional deaths by 2030. So what will it take to end malaria for good? We'll put that to our guests in a moment. First, this report from Alexandra Byers.
9-month-old Mohammed had a fever for 3 days before his family took him to the nearest health centre in northern Cameroon. But it was too late. He died of malaria that day.
I don't want anyone else to ever catch malaria.
He's not alone. Dija and Daoudi Amadou recently lost their 5-month-old girl to the disease, which is transmitted by mosquitoes.
From that day until today, I don't feel comfortable even going to work at the farm. My body does not have the energy to work much because I think of the child.
Malaria deaths are surging in Cameroon this year. Local health officials are blaming it on foreign aid cuts, specifically by the Trump administration. Before the cuts, those babies could have been diagnosed earlier by one of more than 2,000 U.S.-funded health workers who travel to the region's remote villages. They might have been treated by life-saving drug for severe malaria paid for by U.S. funds, which is now in short supply.
This year, from January to August, we have registered many cases of death in the community. If we continue like this, the primary consequence is a cascade of deaths.
And it's not just Cameroon. Outbreaks are surging in Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Extreme weather and humanitarian crises are increasing the risk factors. And the insecticides and drugs that have been used for years are becoming less effective. At the same time, governments are cutting their contributions to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which finances nearly 60% of the world's anti-malaria efforts, like mosquito nets, indoor spraying, and preventative drugs. Germany has cut its funding by nearly a quarter, and the US and UK are considering similar moves. A report released this week estimates these cuts could cause 500 million more cases and the death of 750,000 more children by 2030. They're warning of the loss of a generation to malaria. In the face of the uncertainty, calls are growing for African countries to take control. Uganda has launched the continent's largest rollout of vaccines. Kenya is pushing ahead with domestic vaccine financing. Nigeria has expanded its health budget, and others are looking at the domestic production of nets, healthcare training, and establishing their own supply chains, determined to protect their future. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In Pretoria, in South Africa, we have Joy Phumaphi, an Executive Secretary of the African Leaders Malaria Alliance. In Amman, Dr. Tanya Haj-Hassan, a paediatric intensive care doctor. And in Glasgow, in Scotland, Heather Ferguson, a Professor of Medical Entomology and Disease Ecology at the University of Glasgow. A warm welcome to you all. Heather Ferguson in Glasgow, I'll start with you. What are the new threats in the fight against malaria?
against malaria has been stymied by several threats. Some of them are biological, so things we really need a scientific answer, things like insecticide resistance to mosquitoes against the intervention we use against them, resistance against by the parasite against the drugs for treatment. But that's only part of the story. We're having this increasing maelstrom of climate change, which looks like it's going to be driving the spread of malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases in different places. Also conflict and civil disruptions that are preventing the implementation of control programs, health systems, and finally also these unprecedented cuts to global funding that we're seeing now.
Joy Phumaphi in Pretoria, as Heather laid out there, and your report says that cutting funding risks the deadliest resurgence we've ever seen to malaria. What do you fear will happen, Joy?
What we fear will happen is that countries that are experiencing exactly the threats that have just been alluded to, rising temperature, rising in flooding, and being unable to distribute the new commodities, which are more expensive, like the dual insecticide treated nets, that we are going to have 525 million new cases, and we are going to now have 990,000 more deaths, and 750,000 of these will be children under the age of 5. So we are going to see a rapid escalation in both the disease burden and in the mortality of children, and the impact on the economic growth of the continent in terms of lost labor cost, lost profits, and lost productivity overall is going to wipe 83 billion from the sub-Saharan African economy. This is what we fear, and it's a real threat because we have seen it happening in the past, and we are beginning to see signs of it already this year.
Tanya, Haj-Hassan, your missions often take you to parts of the world, particularly Africa, where malaria is a major problem. What are the biggest challenges you're currently facing or you face when trying to treat this disease?
So I'm a pediatrician. I care primarily for children, and malaria is one of the leading causes of of death in children worldwide. I think it's top third leading cause in children between the ages of 1 and 5 years old after pneumonia and diarrheal disease illnesses. It's really devastating. I mean, you see children that are otherwise healthy presenting sometimes within hours or days of their first symptoms of that particular acute episode of malaria. And then they develop one of two main deadly complications, severe anemia related to malaria, and the other is cerebral malaria, where the parasite is actually infecting the brain, and the children develop life-threatening brain swelling. The brain ultimately herniates downwards and the child dies. And I've had countless children die under my care despite initiating therapy for malaria. It is very hard to treat in its advanced stages. That's why prevention is so important, especially these insecticide-treated bed nets that the speakers before me were speaking of in terms of expensive and increasingly expensive preventative measures that become very difficult to access in resource-limited settings, even more difficult to access when conflict, I was in Sudan recently, when conflict coincides with malaria season, and then with climate change just making things even worse. And then you compound on top of that severe acute malnutrition, where children's immunity is weakened by their malnourished state, and then malaria becomes even more deadly.
Tanya, we keep hearing we get treated nets to improve protection against malaria. There are a couple of vaccines on the market now, and yet you're still coming back with these harrowing stories. Why is malaria remains such a challenge to tackle?
I'll give you an example of a child I treated recently. The child did not have malaria. The child had severe acute malnutrition. This was in Sudan just about a month ago. And when the child died of complications of their severe acute malnutrition, our hospital had a policy where the mother could take the mosquito net home with her after discharge. In this case, unfortunately, the child died. And so the mother, while we were resuscitating the child in the final stages, the mother started packing the mosquito net to take with her. That is how valuable a mosquito net is for a family in that kind of resource-limited setting. You're talking about settings where people are barely able to afford nutrition and the basics of human survival. And so something like a mosquito net becomes increasingly valuable and prohibitively expensive. And then when you have funding cuts on top of that, you can imagine how something that really, a disease that really could have been eradicated a long time ago, a disease that could have been controlled a long time ago. We could have had malaria, instead of being the third leading cause of death, not a leading cause of death in children at all. We haven't been able to achieve that because malaria primarily affects resource-limited settings. Yeah. And the research priorities and research funding is dictated by resource-rich settings that do not prioritize these subjects that do not impact them.
So, Heather, help us expand a little bit on what Tanya was explaining there. First of all, what are the biological challenges of treating malaria, the parasite evolution, the resistance to insecticide, and then we were talking about the challenges that it's a first world issue that is being imposed, first world solutions being imposed on the developing world.
Right. So briefly, just to reflect a little bit more on the biological challenges. So it's true that some of the most valuable tools that we've had to have a large impact of malaria over the past 2 decades have been based on mosquito control. And that is primarily through the development and mass rollout of insecticide-treated nets. It's a brilliant intervention. I think it should have got the Nobel Prize for Medicine a long time ago. It's a really simple way of protecting people when they sleep, which is during the hours when malaria mosquitoes primarily bite, from becoming infected and also killing those mosquitoes. One of the challenges that we have had, that is meaning that despite this intervention effectively having the prevalence of malaria in African children since 2000, progress has stalled over the last few years, primarily because the mosquitoes are, becoming resistant to the insecticides, but also we are seeing the mosquitoes adapt in other ways. So things like instead of coming inside the house to bite people during, sleeping hours when they would be under a bed net, shifting to maybe biting outdoors and earlier in the evening when people are not protected. So on that side of things, we need not just to rely on that single tool of the traditional insecticide-treated bed net. We need better bed nets, exactly like the ones that Joy alluded to, that combine different compounds that still work against mosquitoes that are resistant to the standard bed net. But we also need new tools that will cover people in all the rest of the time in their environment, when they're outside of the home. Also, when we think about conflict or climate migrants, to protect people on the move, people who have to flee. So we do need these tools. And then just with respect to this extremely important and relevant point about why this hasn't been prioritised, I completely agree that for too long, people in high-income countries, people like my country, have just primarily seen this as something that doesn't affect us, something that happens in the tropics and we don't need to worry about. And that has never been true. We are all interconnected. And with climate change, we are now seeing many of the countries, many of the regions of the world where this disease was eliminated are now being threatened again. And if we don't get our act together soon and realise that we are all in this together, those of us on the margins for now, we are not safe until we really show pragmatic solidarity and make sure that we are standing shoulder to shoulder with our colleagues in the endemic epicentre and fighting this together.
Well, and just on that then, Heather, because I know that you're looking at the possible assessing the risk of emergence of mosquito-borne disease in Scotland, of all places. That's the last place you would imagine something like this to happen. Is there a risk of a resurgence of malaria and mosquito-borne diseases in the developed world?
Indeed, there is, and we are seeing this continually. So other mosquito-borne diseases, such as West Nile virus, we are now seeing this spreading throughout Europe, certainly in North America too, further and further north, causing, not nearly the same burden and deaths as we see with malaria. So we need to keep our eyes on the major risk, but also issues like dengue and chikungunya are really out of control and coming closer all the time. And of course, I'm here in Scotland. This is absolutely not the country that you would think of when you think about mosquito-borne disease. But historically, we had quite a lot of malaria transmission here. And up until about 200 years ago, there was a good number of malaria cases along the southern Scotland and the east coast. And that was eliminated largely by changes to living conditions, so poverty, which we know is also the main underlying driver of these diseases, but also changes to land use and the way that people were living. Yeah. And any time we see changes to the environment, like it's happening in a mass scale, yes, certainly it's bringing a lot of these risks closer. So my priority will always remain on how we can tackle these diseases in endemic settings, but at the same time, we really need to understand the risks globally, and if anything, use that to build solidarity between this and seeing this as a common problem we all need to face together.
Joy, we do hear that we seem to be getting closer to eliminating malaria. It might happen maybe in our lifetimes. New nets, better insecticides, a couple of vaccines. Is the virus just managing to stay one step ahead, or can we eliminate this malaria?
I believe we can eliminate it. As has just been said, it's viewed as a disease of poverty. But I think one thing that we have to pay specific attention to is that right now we're at a crossroads. In Africa, it's affecting about 250 million people. But if we do not ramp up our interventions and cover more people, right now, with all our national malaria programs, we are only able to cover 60 to 70% of the interventions that are required. Even with all the ODA that we have been receiving, we have only been at 60, 70% of the coverage that is required. Now, if we do not ramp up beyond that 70%, and even if we just sustain where we are now, we are going to get extra cases. But if we get 500 million more cases, that will be a major part of the African population, and the impact that is going to have on the GDP of our economies is that we are going to have 4.3 billion reduction in agricultural production. Earlier on, we spoke about nutrition. And when the parents are suffering from malaria, they are completely unproductive. And unfortunately, malaria attacks most during the plowing season because that is the rainy season. And when farmers, when rural communities are not able to grow their crops, then the malnutrition increases. So it drives the families further into poverty. But we have seen those countries that have been able to reduce malaria incidence or eliminate it, that there's a huge boost in tourism. We actually predict that there would be a $2 billion growth in tourism in the economy, and there's 20.7 billion decrease in health costs if we eliminated malaria. So the elimination of malaria really is going to create a huge economic boon. And the economic boon will also benefit the G7 countries, because it is estimated that 112 billion with the malaria elimination. So we are really in a situation where yes, we can eliminate it, but we have to bring all our resources to the table. One of the challenges that the African countries have been facing is that even with recurrent budget allocation, it's very difficult for them to increase budget allocation to health. They have been increasing it, but with the debt servicing that most of our countries are burdened with, because you'll know that we borrow from the IMF at much higher interest rates than developed economies. Yes. So our debt burden is much, much heavier. So we really cannot increase budget allocation to the extent that we would like to be able to.
Okay, and then just quickly about the funding then, Joy, because your pitch is if you fund malaria in the developing world, the eradication of malaria in the developing world, it benefits the developed world. But you know funding's being cut. Germany's reduced its contribution to the global fund to fight TB, AIDS and malaria. The UK likely to do the same. And the big elephant in the room, we don't know what the US is going to give in the next funding round. The current White House, known for its transactional approach to politics, is that the pitch you're trying to make? You help them and it will benefit you.
The US government currently is focusing a lot on the benefits of trade and having a more balanced trade and a win-win situation between trading partners. And I believe that there is no better way of attaining this between Africa and the US than in the elimination of malaria. There is no better route because malaria is affecting the mining sector tremendously, dramatically reducing mining production, because that is where malaria incidence is heaviest because of all the holes that are dug up by the mines, ideal breeding sites for mosquitoes. So the mining sector, the manufacturing sector, all of them are heavily affected by malaria. So if the US wants to dramatically enhance or increase trade with the African continent, whether it is on rare minerals or in any other mining product, then you have to eliminate malaria. And the return on investment is massive. But I also feel that we have to target the private sector. The private sector benefits from this investment, and they must also contribute towards the replenishment of the global fund.
Okay. Tanya, the African Union has a target of eliminating malaria by 2030, something the Global Fund already says is a daunting challenge. From what you've seen when you're having to treat malaria, is that a realistic prospect, given the way it's tackled at the moment?
I mean, I'd like to think it is, but just given where the world is going and where it's been going in the last several years, the priorities of the way the priorities are changing, the way international organizations trusted with empowering countries to achieve these goals these organizations are undermined, they're underfunded, they're defunded. I don't think we're moving in the right direction, and certainly not at the pace we need to achieve that goal. So I'm not optimistic, but I would love to be proven wrong.
Heather, do you believe it's a realistic prospect, the eradication of malaria by 2030? It's not very far away.
An alternative timeline where if different decisions and different priorities had happened over the last year, I think that we could be, in a substantially different track. But from where we are now, because of all the reasons that Tanya just mentioned, including the sort of like contraction of funding, increasing isolation of countries, and this idea that in investing all of our health globally is not a good investment, which it clearly is, it's really put a lot of these targets off track. So while it looks grim, I think we can never afford to give up hope. And we have to continue to work as hard as we can to pursue this goal. And whether or not we take off elimination by 2030, or we can save, many, many more children from facing this severe illness and death that Tanya has just described, it is absolutely our obligation to keep fighting towards that goal.
Heather, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are you able to identify any sort of last mile challenges in controlling malaria to eradicate it? Does something advance so far and then there's this last step that's a challenge?
Certainly, and I think there are some countries now that have made significant progress. Some African countries that are at least have regions that are close to elimination. Certainly South Africa, except for the border and the areas of Mozambique, are on track for elimination. And there are additional challenges, I think, sometimes when you are so close to elimination, there's few cases left, and then sometimes that becomes less of a priority for funding because you're not seeing the same number of sick people. You're not seeing maybe they need to keep on investing in that constant surveillance, the constant keeping up high interventions coverage. But that's why it's really important that when you are in that stage, you don't forget about the burden that was there, and you have to keep on pushing on that.
Joy, donor countries are facing so many competing priorities for funding these days. You touched on the need to appeal to the private sector. Is that where you feel you're going to have to focus your attention because of the challenges facing governments?
We should focus on both because it's a win-win for the governments as well. Countries like Eswatini, countries like Zambia have started what we call end malaria councils and funds, which are partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. And the private sector has come to the table, that is the local private sector, and is actually helping to fight malaria. And, as has been said, there are countries like South Africa, Namibia, Eswatini that are very close to elimination and that can eliminate just with some additional commitment. But countries like Zambia are not far behind, primarily because the private sector is partnering with government. So I believe that the private sector has a huge responsibility, and it has Zambia Sugar, for example, has seen a huge boost in profits and in production because they simply eliminated malaria where they were growing the sugar cane and manufacturing the sugar. They were able to see increased production of up to 40%. So the private sector can play a critical role. But I think it will only play a critical role when governments continue to prioritize this area. So we are asking our partners not to leave at the table as at this critical time. We need now to demonstrate that we can eliminate malaria. And I think a critical number of countries can eliminate malaria by 2030, but only with commitment from both the public and the private sector.
OK, well, let's hope you get that commitment. Thanks to all of our guests, to Joy Phumaphi, to Tanya Haj-Hassan and Heather Ferguson. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the entire team here, bye for now.